There was a time when fashion sold one of the most seductive myths in modern culture. The myth said the runway could still surprise itself. A girl could be standing in an airport, walking through a market, sitting in a food court, and within a year, her face could be everywhere. Kate Moss at JFK, Naomi Campbell in Covent Garden, Gisele Bündchen in Sao Paulo. Those stories were repeated so often because they made the industry feel open, almost democratic. Beauty, presence, timing, that was the fantasy fashion kept selling. That promise did not vanish overnight. It thinned out, season by season, as fashion stopped rewarding discovery and started rewarding familiarity. The shift was gradual until it became impossible to miss. By then, the runway looked glamorous. What it no longer looked like was an open door. The old story worked because parts of it were true. Kate Moss really was discovered at 14 by Sarah Dukas at JFK. Naomi Campbell really was spotted in Covent Garden as a teenager by Beth Bolt. Gisele Bündchen really was found in Sao Paulo while still a young teenager. Those origin stories were documented, repeated, and polished into legend because they gave fashion something priceless. Proof that the industry could still pull a stranger out of ordinary life and turn her into an icon. That promise carried enormous power. If you were a teenage girl far from Paris, Milan, London, or New York, you could look at those stories and think the door was open a crack for you too. The scouts were real. The search was real. The transformation, at least for a small number of girls, was real. Fashion loved telling that part of the story because it made the whole system feel romantic instead of controlled. What got buried was everything that happened after the lucky moment. Being found was only the entrance. The real industry began after that, inside agencies, casting rooms, editorial offices, and model apartments. It was already shaped by money, patience, and survival. The fairy tale focused on the first chapter because the rest was less flattering. Still, for a stretch of the 80s and 90s, the machine on the other side of discovery could produce something extraordinary. Fashion magazines arrived thick and heavy. A cover mattered. A photographer mattered. A casting director mattered. A model could appear in one editorial, then another, until the face stopped being new and started becoming unforgettable. If fame was being built slowly, deliberately, by a system that still had time to build it, this was the real engine of the supermodel era. Beauty helped, but beauty alone was never enough. A small circle of magazines, photographers, creative directors, and luxury brands had the power to keep returning the same face to the public until she became impossible to ignore. A girl from nowhere still had to survive the system around her, yet once she broke through, that system could turn recognition into stardom. The word supermodel gets used so freely now that it has lost some of its weight. At its height, it described something far more rare, a model whose fame reached well beyond fashion. She was recognized by people who did not follow runway seasons, campaign credits, or magazine culture. She was not simply working, she had become known. That kind of fame required a particular media world. Print still had concentrated power. Major magazines did not need to compete with 1,000 feeds refreshing every second. When Vogue or Harper's Bazaar or Elle pushed a face again and again, the audience absorbed it. Readers learned a model the way radio listeners once learned singers, through repetition, scarcity, and the authority of whoever controlled the channel. And the system could take aesthetic risks because the institutions were strong enough to carry the bet. A new face did not need instant public recognition. Editors and photographers could keep returning to her until recognition formed. That patience was not generosity. It was the business model. Fashion had fewer windows to sell an image through, so it knew how to invest in one. The old model of fame also depended on a different kind of mystery. Not everything had to be visible at once. A walk could matter. A face could matter. A presence could matter before the audience knew what the model ate for breakfast or how many people liked her last post. That distance gave the industry room to build aura. It could introduce someone before the audience demanded proof in numbers. The old system was never fair. It had gatekeepers everywhere. And those gatekeepers had biases, favorites, prejudices, and blind spots. But it still rewarded a kind of slow, professional accumulation. You learned the job, you stayed visible, you survived long enough for the industry to decide you were worth building around. That was hard, but it was at least a runway-centered process. It asked a young model to prove she could keep holding attention over time, not simply arrive with attention already attached. Fashion also had stronger reasons to keep models at the center of the image. Before social media, a campaign did not need a celebrity's off-runway life attached to it every second. The picture itself could do the work. That left more room for models whose power came from how they looked on the page rather than how much noise they generated outside it. Then the infrastructure that made all of that possible started to thin out, not with one dramatic collapse, with a slow erosion that changed what fashion needed from its faces. The older system could separate popularity from long-term value. A model did not have to arrive famous to become important. She had to stay visible long enough for editors, photographers, and casting directors to keep choosing her. That process could be narrow, harsh, and subjective, but it was slow. A cover could shift a career. Editorial runs could build recognition. With fewer channels, the center held more power, and that power turned repetition into fame. That is why the 90s still looms so large in fashion memory. The institutions around the models were strong enough to magnify them into fixtures. Fashion print did not collapse all at once. It wore down over time. Major titles reduced their frequency, some moved online, and the business leaned harder into digital revenue and faster formats. That shift changed more than where people looked at fashion. It weakened one of the systems that had once given the industry its power to build stars. When magazines stopped arriving with the same consistency and authority, fashion lost one of its strongest tools for turning a new face into a familiar one. There were fewer editorials, fewer chances to return the same model to the public, and less room for recognition to grow gradually. A face that might once have become iconic through steady exposure now had far less space to settle into the culture. The attention did not disappear. It scattered. Social platforms absorbed it, then measured it, and then trained brands to chase whatever could be measured fastest. Reach could be counted. Engagement could be counted. Visibility could be turned into a number that executives could carry into meetings. That changed what a model was worth. Under the old structure, value accumulated. Under the newer one, value needed to be legible immediately. Fashion did not stop caring about looks. It started caring whether those looks came with audience, press, circulation, and chatter built in. The image still mattered, but the image was no longer enough on its own. That is the point where nepotism stopped looking accidental and started fitting the business logic of the industry. A famous surname did not need to prove itself from zero. It arrived carrying story, recognition, nostalgia, and press interest before the first walk even happened. And in a business that had grown more nervous about risk, that kind of head start was irresistible. The runway still existed, but the runway was no longer the great introduction machine it had once been. It had become one channel inside a louder ecosystem. Once that happened, being unknown became harder to justify inside a business that wanted visible return right away. Fashion nepotism does not need an explicit rule to shape outcomes. The system does not have to say the quiet part out loud. It only has to reward the qualities that famous children already possess before they book a major show: name recognition, media interest, inherited visual familiarity, and built-in audience. Look at the pattern. Kaya Gerber made her runway debut at Calvin Klein's Spring 2018 show at 16, and the debut landed as an event. Kendall Jenner's Marc Jacobs runway debut in 2014 was treated as news the second it happened because reality television fame had already made her legible to a mass audience. Lila Moss made her runway debut by opening and closing Miu Miu's Spring-Summer 2021 show, a placement most working models would spend years trying to reach. These are concrete, documented examples of immediate elite placement. The point is not talent. The point is speed, access, and visibility. It proves something else. The modern system values compressed visibility. It likes a debut that already comes with a headline. It likes a casting that can circulate before the model has built runway credibility the old way. It likes a face that arrives half-explained to the public. By 2014, Vogue had already named a new kind of model celebrity with its Instagirls package. Social media fluency had moved closer to the center of the profession. Naomi Campbell recognized the shift immediately and said she was glad to have come up in an older system, where her generation had to fight for visibility in a very different way. Her reaction captured how sharply the industry had changed. Once follower counts and built-in visibility entered the equation, celebrity offspring became especially appealing to brands and casting teams. A famous last name came with more than recognition. It came with press interest, public curiosity, and an audience already paying attention. Long before the industry gave that dynamic a label, brands had already learned how to turn it into value. That is why modern runway nepotism feels less like a side effect and more like a casting logic. A famous daughter or son often arrives as more than a new runway face. The name already carries press, recognition, and a ready-made story. In a fashion economy increasingly organized around pre-sold attention, that package makes sense. What changed was not only who got cast, but what a casting now had to do. A debut used to be the beginning of a test. Now it often arrives as a fully formed media event. The name is familiar. The resemblance is already a story. The coverage writes itself before the walk has had time to mean anything on its own. Once fashion started rewarding visibility it could measure, a famous surname became less of a side advantage and more of a practical asset. Fashion always liked power, but it used to hide that preference behind taste. Social media stripped away some of that mystique. Once audience size became visible, the old claim that only insiders knew what mattered got harder to defend. Some of the judgment moved out of the casting room and onto public numbers. Models.com now has a social ranking built around social media reach. For an industry database with real influence, that says plenty on its own. By that point, follower count and online visibility had already become part of how professional value was being read inside fashion. At the same time, the creator economy had grown too large for fashion to brush aside. Goldman Sachs projected in 2023 that it could expand from about $250 billion to roughly $480 billion by 2027. Fashion was already moving with that current, leaning further into influencers, brand ambassadors, and the kind of visibility that can be counted and sold. That same merge shows up in law. New York's Fashion Workers Act, which took effect on June 19, 2025, makes clear that people providing modeling services can include social media influencers or content creators depending on the work involved. The legal language caught up to what the business had already decided. Modeling and online visibility were no longer cleanly separate categories. Once that happened, instinct lost some of its old prestige. A casting director could still talk about presence, movement, and face, but the numbers were sitting there too, easy to point to, easy to defend, easy to sell upward. Yet the unknown girl with a remarkable walk was now competing with someone whose audience could be counted before the casting even began. That is where the algorithm made the old romance much harder to sustain. Discovery still existed. Trusting discovery did not. Once social media numbers became standard reference points, fashion changed from a culture that interpreted value to one that increasingly displayed it. The shift was subtle at first. Magazine packages celebrated digitally fluent models. Brand deals leaned harder into online relevance. Then the numbers stopped feeling supplementary and started looking central. Visibility had become something that could be checked before a fitting, before a show, before a campaign was even announced. What makes that especially important in modeling is that the profession once depended on a cultivated opacity. Industry insiders liked to think they could detect something the public could not yet see. Social metrics weakened that mystique. Suddenly, there was a visible scoreboard. And you did not need 20 years in fashion to understand why one name looked commercially safer than another. You could just check the audience. That has consequences for unknown talent. If a model begins from zero, the old system could treat zero as possibility. The new system is far more likely to treat zero as risk. That is a brutal change because some of the greatest faces in fashion history began as precisely that. Unknowns who had not yet accumulated proof outside the image itself. The public version of the modeling dream focuses on discovery. The part that gets discussed less is money. Who can afford the slow beginning? Who can afford the unpaid castings, the travel, the fittings, the dead time, the housing, the weak first seasons, the long wait before real leverage appears? Those questions decide far more than the fairy tale ever admitted. Reporting on model labor has been blunt for years. Early runway work often pays little or nothing once expenses are factored in. Agencies have historically fronted costs, then recouped them from future earnings. That structure leaves many young models starting their careers already owing money inside a business that offers unstable income. Investigations and labor reporting have repeatedly described debt, delayed payment, and financial opacity as ordinary features of the trade, not rare scandals. That is where class advantage becomes decisive. A wealthy family can treat the early stage of modeling as a long investment. Rent can be covered, flights can be covered, weak seasons can be survived. The young model can stay in the right city long enough to become visible without being crushed by the financial clock. A model without that cushion faces a different reality. She may need the wrong jobs too early. She may accept deductions she cannot fight. She may leave the market before the runway credits have time to build into anything stable. The mythology says talent rises. The economics decide how long talent gets to stay in the room. This is one reason the nepotism debate inside fashion became so heated. Working models were not only complaining about famous parents, and they were pointing at the invisible safety net around those parents' children. Vittoria Soretti's sharp response during the Nepo baby debate landed because it cut through the vague language and named the real resentment. Some people enter with access paid for. The first day is not equally expensive for everyone. That is also why the Fashion Workers Act matters beyond legal detail. It caps commissions, bars signing fees and deposits, requires clearer compensation terms, restricts automatic renewals, and limits how expenses can be deducted. Laws like that do not appear out of nowhere. They appear when an industry has normalized the same complaints for too long. The financial barrier to entry is not a side story. It sits underneath the glamour and shapes who can stay long enough to build a career. And once that floor becomes expensive enough, the children of the wealthy stop looking like an odd exception. They start looking like the logical winners of the system. The Fashion Workers Act also exposes how much of the business had been allowed to operate in the shadows. Once lawmakers start setting rules around commissions, deductions, deposits, contract length, payment timing, power of attorney, and digital replicas, the old glamour begins to look thinner. Those rules exist because too much had been left vague for too long. It also sharpens the real issue underneath the resentment. Young models were entering a labor system shaped by opaque contracts, unstable pay, and constant financial pressure. In a business like that, family money does more than make life easier. It gives a model room to stay, absorb losses, and survive the years that break other careers before they begin. And when survival itself depends so heavily on private resources, elite families stop looking simply well-connected. They begin to look built for the system in a way other entrants are not. What faded was not modeling itself. Models still work, new faces still break through, and the runway still knows how to command attention. What changed was the way fashion builds value. It moved away from slowly shaping unfamiliar faces into stars and leaned harder toward choosing faces that arrive with recognition already attached. That change shows up in the look of the industry. When fashion leans too hard on safety, repetition settles in. The runway narrows in what it rewards and in what it is willing to gamble on. Fashion has always repeated itself to some degree, but the newer system is more drawn to what already reads as familiar, marketable, and publicly approved before the clothes even start moving. You can see that tightening when you watch a season unfold and realize how many high-profile debuts already came with fame from somewhere else. Reality television, famous parents, celebrity proximity, existing social followings. Fashion no longer has to introduce these faces from the beginning, so more and more often it chooses not to try. The older system knew how to do something rarer. It could make a room stop for someone nobody had been watching. It could build suspense around a face instead of rewarding one that showed up pre-announced. It could turn uncertainty into fascination. That took patience, editorial power, and a willingness to be surprised. It also depended on decision-makers who trusted their own eye before the market stepped in to validate it. Those conditions have weakened. Even the industry's nostalgia gives that away. When brands want weight, they still reach for legacy names from the true supermodel era. That says plenty on its own. The newer system can generate visibility non-stop, yet it still has trouble producing the same kind of lasting cultural presence. It can launch a debut everywhere in a day. It has far more trouble creating a face that defines an era. So the loss, if there is one, is not about individual stars. It is about the idea that the runway alone could still turn a stranger into someone unforgettable. Scouting has not disappeared. Unknown models are still being found. Fashion has not fully sealed itself off from surprise. But the incentives are different now, and incentives shape culture faster than myth does. A scout who finds a face in an ordinary place is still doing something real. The problem comes later, when that face enters a system that now asks different questions. Does she already have attention? Does she already come with press? Can the booking be justified instantly? If the answer is no, she is competing uphill against candidates whose value can be explained before they even walk. That does not mean every famous child will last. Some will fade. Some will prove they belong once the inherited attention burns off. The point is earlier than that. The system now grants a premium to not being a risk on day one. That changes who gets introduced, how quickly they rise, and how many unknowns are quietly filtered out before the public ever sees them. There are small signs of strain in the current model. Celebrity overload produces fatigue. Luxury marketing keeps searching for authenticity while rewarding the safest forms of familiarity. Regulation is finally forcing some transparency into labor practices. None of that restores the old machine by itself. It only shows that the present version is not fully stable either. Fashion cannot quite let go of the old promise because the old promise remains too useful. The idea that greatness can still be found in ordinary life keeps the industry from looking like what critics increasingly say it has become: a closed loop of money, access, legacy, and metrics. That is why the discovery myth survives even after the structure around it has changed. The myth is not pure fiction. That is what makes it powerful. Unknowns still break through. Scouts still scout. A face can still alter a career, a campaign, a season. But the larger system no longer seems designed to depend on that happening. It can function without discovery now, and that may be the deepest change of all. When an industry can secure attention quickly instead of building it slowly, patience starts to look inefficient. And when it can cast familiarity instead of introducing novelty, risk starts to look inefficient. And when enough people accept that logic, the door never has to slam shut to become harder to pass through. It only has to open more often for the already known. The supermodel was never only a woman in extraordinary clothes. She was evidence that fashion could still be startled by what it found. That is the part under pressure now. The runway still has light, cameras, sponsors, headlines, all of it. What it has less of is trust in the unknown. The girls who once would have embodied the old promise are still out there. They are in airports, in malls, in neighborhoods fashion rarely visits until it needs a myth again. The question is not whether they exist. The question is whether the industry still has the patience to notice them before a last name, a bigger following, or a spreadsheet takes their place. The runway kept selling that promise for years. It has not fully stopped. It has simply made the price of believing it higher, and once belief becomes expensive, the dream starts belonging to fewer people.